Good afternoon. Here, thank you, Dr. Morey, Professor Dr. Morey, and it's an interesting experience for me to be here. Thank you so much to be at this prestigious university here in Kyoto as well as in Japan generally, for which I have great admiration and respect. Let me say it was 35 years ago when I had left Taiwan as a young graduate student. I was speaking at a Rotary Club in Taipei in 1975, where I met probably the most famous Protestant, Norman Vincent Peale, and that same year, the most famous evangelical, Billy Graham. I met both of them that year, and it was actually my plan at that point in life to go back to the United States, finish my graduate studies in political science, and when China opened, I would become a foreign service officer to China. But it was Dr. Norman Vincent Peale and Dr. Billy Graham who persuaded me to do otherwise, and I'm so glad that they did. Tell a story that I have told to Iranian ayatollahs, I've told it to Israeli rabbis, I've told it even in Lhasa, Tibet, to Tibetan Buddhists, and the story goes like this. Evangelical is driving his Jeep Cherokee over hill and dale, and he sees a shepherd who's quietly out tending his flock. He jumps out of his truck and goes over to speak to this shepherd. He says to the shepherd, who's quite shocked by having him come upon him as he has, he says to the shepherd, this American evangelical, he says, "If I can tell you how many sheep you have, can I have one?" The shepherd is quite dumbstruck by all of this, and of course he says yes. So the American goes back into his truck, gets on GPS. I call that God's positioning satellite. Most other people don't call it that, but I call it that. And within a few moments, he goes back to the shepherd and he says, "You have 1,681 sheep." Responds, "That's totally amazing. How did you know? Go pick one out." So the American goes over, the American evangelical, he goes over and picks one out, puts it in his truck, and he's driving away when the shepherd runs up and knocks on his window. Well, the shepherd says to him, he says, if I can tell you what you do for a living, can I have my sheep back? And the American evangelical says, "Yes, if you can tell me what I do for a living." And the shepherd says, "That's very simple. You are a consultant." The American, in astonishment, he says, "Well, that's exactly right. How did you know?" And the shepherd says, "Well, that's very simple." He said, "You come into my world, you answer questions I've never asked, leave out, charge me a lot of money. But most of all," he says, "you don't know anything. You don't know diddly squat." He says, "You took my sheepdog." Even the Iranians, the Chinese, the Israelis, everyone understands the perils of being a consultant. Well, I don't want to be a consultant who comes here and attempts to answer questions you don't have. But I do believe there are important things that you need to know that are occurring in America. And thus, I'm very excited to tell you about them. I often tell my audiences, ask yourself this question. Which is it that you believe? Now, you've come here today to hear about theology and history and political science and many disciplines. But I would like to say that most of my audiences, I ask this question. There are two types of people in the world, G.K. Chesterton wrote 100 years ago. There are those, the first type, they believe that when the trees are waving wildly in the wind, the first group of people, they think it's the wind that moves the trees. Thinks that the motion of the trees creates the wind. The former view was held by humankind through most of its centuries, and it's only in recent years that a new breed of people have emerged who blindly hold that it's the movement of the trees that creates the wind. For centuries, the consensus has always held that the invisible is behind and gives energy to the visible. In other words, the consensus has always been that the invisible is behind and gives energy to the visible. But that consensus has broken down. And I would like to say to you that the first view is that held by the Judeo-Christian tradition. The second view, namely that it's the motion of the trees that creates the wind, is a kind of metaphor for secularism, for relativism in the West. The human dogma is that the wind moves the trees. the great human heresy is that the trees move the wind. What I'm going to say to you today is that there are 3 reasons we are at a defining moment in human history, and that there are 3 things that distinguish the modern day new evangelicals from their parents and grandparents. And those 3 things are that we have, as new evangelicals, we have a new vision, we have a new strategy, and we have new tactics. But I want you to know, first of all, that I believe, most importantly, and it affects you as much as we in the West, we are at a defining moment in human history for 3 different reasons. Today, it's a very troubling time. It's a troubling time because they worry. They worry about terrorism, the growing poverty and unemployment in America. They worry about the uncertainty from overextending our nation into 2 wars at one time, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And for many millions of people, it's as if the wheels of civilization are coming off. There's this other question of whether or not the reigning worldviews can solve these problems. In other words, the ideas and solutions that we've operated under for decades in America and have worked in the past no longer seem to work because the conditions in the situation has changed. And I would suggest to you that this is why we are at a defining moment. We must make this shift in 3 ways. We must make a shift in our thinking, in our perception, and in our behavior in order to succeed in this, the 21st century. And one example of this is the shift in the Renaissance, which followed the Middle Ages, a period of darkness and ignorance, which unleashed in the Renaissance a flourishing of European artistic and scientific achievement. And many people today, in looking back at that period, say that the roots of the Renaissance were intellectual and ideological change as much as substantive change. In other words, that was one of those defining moments in human history, this shift from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And what is required today is a similar kind of shift in thinking, perception, and behavior. We are at a defining moment, first of all, because a great shift in energy and power is occurring in human history. The economic revolution throughout time, for example, has been driven by a transition, a shift in energy, because energy powers every aspect of human activity. The shift you see to renewables, that is, solar, geothermal, wind, and the rest, these are simply a reflection of a shift in energy that we're going to have to make in the way we think, perceive, and behave in very fundamental ways. The irony of it is that this shift causes, at times, an upheaval that stresses people in ways they wouldn't otherwise feel stressed. You see, the upheaval and stress that accompanies these transformations also tend to provoke legions of doomsayers and end-of-times religious revivals. You may have heard of the Left Behind series. It is the most famous book series, probably the most popular in American history. Over 40 million copies have been sold and another 17 million in spin-offs. The authors of the Left Behind series, Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, annually receive approximately over $100 million from the sales of these books. Picture, the Left Behind sagas begin with a mysterious event. 1/3 of the passengers on a transatlantic flight suddenly disappear, leaving only their clothes behind. What has happened? In an instant, it's what evangelicals call the rapture, where every true believing Christian and every child under the age of 12 vanishes in an instant to a better place, and all others face the tribulation. There is even a radio series called Family Radio that today predicts the end of the earth on April 12th of 2011 that will be followed by the tribulation and the return of Jesus Christ, and ultimately you see the end of the earth in October of 2011. And this is broadcast over the worldwide network of Family Radio. In fact, you can simply go to familyradio.org and you can read it about it. The end is almost here, is what it's called, www.familyradio.org. The end is nearer than you think, is the message. Say to yourself, what in the world does this have to do with the new evangelicals? Finding one of those defining moments is that of energy and the end times dispute. And what is occurring is that the new evangelicals, you see, who have taken the position, as have I, that we have a responsibility to care for this earth, find themselves care for this earth, that is, in this shift toward renewable energies and the like, we have a responsibility to care for earth because we believe that climate change, global warming, will affect not just millions but billions of people around the globe. And these two communities find themselves quite at different mentalities about the future. One is expecting, you see, the imminent return of Jesus Christ to be raptured to another world and to leave this world in tribulation. And the other, the new evangelicals, are simply saying, now wait just a minute. Wait just a minute. Are we going to leave this earth unattended? To deny our responsibility to care for it because we believe we're going to be raptured to another earth? And so you have this dispute, the first one, the first defining moment over these two communities in the religious world. Those in the evangelicals who say, oh, we need not care for this earth. And the other community saying, we will care for it. Second dispute and the second defining moment, I would suggest to you, is the dispute that is occurring even between new evangelicals and old evangelicals over the question of religion and science. Religious fundamentalists still attack science as dangerous and untrustworthy and point to a literal interpretation of the Bible as the only reliable means of discerning scientific truth. On the other side, there is what are called the new atheists. Voices such as that of Richard Dawkins, who takes the position that a belief in evolution demands atheism. Richard Dawkins says that faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. One side rejects faith, the other side rejects science. And we among the new evangelicals, as well as reasonable people in America, we reject the inescapable end result of these two views, namely that we are forced to choose between these two extremes. Richard Dawkins is on one side. On the other is a very famous Christian who has now been appointed by President Obama as head of the National Institutes of Health. His name, the head of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, he has put it another way. What Mr. Collins says is that there is no conflict here. He says God's domain is to explore the spiritual world. Science's domain is to explore nature. And he says these two worlds, you see, need one another. He says that, you see, to take the one side, that of Richard Dawkins, and reject faith, he says that is wrong. He says the other side, to reject faith, is also wrong. That we have a mutually exclusive choice here. He says that both choices deny truth, both choices are profoundly dangerous, both will diminish the nobility of mankind, and he says both will be devastating to our future. Like our forefathers, that is in the evangelical world, the new evangelicals see no conflict between faith and science, and would frankly like to take a different position than their parents and grandparents. It's a huge difference, and it has political implications. When I came out and supported a number of years ago the position that climate change is real, it provoked a huge backlash against me in the evangelical world. He said, oh, Cizik has joined the liberals. He's joined the scientific community. He's joined the environmentalists. He's joined all those left-wingers, you see, who believe that all that matters is Mother Earth. Look at the Bush administration took advantage of the anti-science, you see, views of American evangelicals to push its support for the fossil fuel industry. This is pretty clear. And the new evangelicals back President Obama's new energy policies and want to see an international treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so the fact, though, that there is a political implication to our views about these subjects is what has provoked some of this dispute within evangelicalism. That wasn't bad enough. My third sin, so to speak, was Well, to share in a public interview with a well-known radio journalist by the name of Terry Gross, who has a program called Fresh Air, and you can go to www.National Public Radio, click Fresh Air, and you can hear about it. But my other sin, in addition to supporting climate change, was to say that I believe the third defining issue that will divide evangelicals in the coming century is that of our response to nuclear weaponry. Conservative evangelicals such as James Dobson and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and all, they said, you should be concerned about abortion, Richard, not nuclear weaponry. And I was at a recent meeting in Paris, and I will be back there again for the second meeting of Global Zero, which is the movement for the elimination of nuclear weapons. I met with Jimmy Carter, who will be back in Paris in a few weeks. And Jimmy Carter said, Richard, don't back down. You see, don't step back. These issues, first of all, the environment, second of all, religion and science, and third, the proliferation of nuclear weapons. These are the defining issues for American evangelicals, and that was Jimmy Carter. See, what Jimmy Carter, former President Carter, what former defense secretaries such as William Perry, who served Bill Clinton, George Shultz, who served Ronald Reagan, you see, each of these former secretaries of state are saying is that the old policy of mutual assured destruction doesn't work in a world where terrorists may gain access to nuclear weapons. If a policy of MAD, or mutually assured destruction, doesn't work where you have non-state actors who are more than willing to die for their cause, and do regularly, you see, in Afghanistan and Iraq, if you have that kind of world, then the idea of MAD as a moral rationale for the perpetual possession of nuclear weapons doesn't work anymore. Now, my critics try to accuse me of being a liberal. It's not possible. In 1983, I had worked for the Association of Evangelicals just 3 years. Invite the President of the United States to speak to us, it would be the first time ever that would have happened. He said what President Reagan should deliver is a speech on the whole debate that was occurring at that time on the placement of cruise missiles in Western Europe and the whole arms debate, indeed the whole Cold War question of the United States versus the Soviet Union. I says, we should invite the President of the United States to address the evangelicals on this question and make a case, a moral case, why the West should win this battle. That's what I wrote in a letter to President Reagan. The speech became by President Reagan on the date of March 6, 1983, his famous Evil Empire speech. And the Soviet Union dissolved. Been at the front lines of that great debate, older evangelicals want to continue it. Despite, you see, the dissolving of the Soviet Union, you see, despite, you see, the rationale for possessing nuclear weapons to be entirely void, despite, you see, those changes that are needed in thinking, perception, and behavior, older evangelicals persist on holding to those ideas. That's where we find ourselves today. In America, a huge divide, a huge dispute. I could tell you it's not really just about the environment. It's not just about, you see, religion and science and that dispute. It's not just about nuclear weaponry. It's about a whole lot of other things too. Okay, so I'll explain that, first of all, that we need to have a new vision. And a new vision is required to think and see more clearly about the future. I tell this story. A man and a wife are driving down the road. They're both quite elderly. And turns to his wife and he says, you know, it's getting a little harder these days. He says, my eyes aren't very good. My vision isn't very clear. He says, my hands are shaking. My hand-eye coordination is bad. He says, but thank God, he says, I can still drive. So let me just say this. What is happening in our country that has huge implications for the rest of the world is the vision thing. Distinguish between the two Bushes. Bush, the first Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41. We call him Bush 41. The second, George W. Bush, George W. Bush we call 43. So we have 41 and 43. 41 got into trouble fundamentally over what it was called the vision thing. What was his vision for the future? Ultimately, the first Bush lost to Bill Clinton in his presidential race over the vision thing. The race for the future, I'm saying the older evangelicals are going to lose as well against the younger evangelicals because they don't have a vision for the future. Dr. Morey did a wonderful job of explaining very briefly to you the evangelical history. But what you additionally need to understand is that North American evangelicalism began in reaction. He said American evangelicals reacted against 19th century biblical criticism and biology, removing themselves from denominations and other Christian bodies that were less alarmed by such developments. Acting against perceived liberalism in the realm of political involvement, fundamentalists separated themselves from the social gospel so decisively that they removed almost any hint of social dynamism from the biblical gospel. In the middle of the last century, neo-evangelicals, as they were called in that time, such as Harold Ockenga, the first president of the association, a pastor of Park Street Church in Boston, Massachusetts, and Carl Henry, the editor of Christianity Today magazine, who I knew when he was alive. He died at 90 just a couple of years ago. They tried to nudge fundamentalists into a more socially aware direction. The movement has retained an ongoing vulnerability to its reactionary impulse. If you are living here in Japan and you're wondering what's going on, let me simply put it this way. American evangelicalism is in huge trouble, not because it's financially or morally or theologically bankrupt. It's in trouble because it faces this huge, significant cultural and generational shift. See, ironically, over 60 years after Carl F.H. Henry's famous book, The Uneasy Conscience of the Modern Fundamentalist, and I know in the next hour or so Dr. Yamamoto is going to respond to me. He says he has a copy of Henry's book called The Uneasy Conscience of the Modern Fundamentalist, in which Dr. Henry, you see, one of the founders of this movement of neo-evangelicalism, 60 years after Henry, we face the same thing. Namely that we can't shake the image of being primarily negative and destructive. I would suggest that, you see, to aspire to a new vision, you've got to have strategy. By the way, as a student of Chinese history, it was Sun Tzu who said, a strategy without a tactics is a slow road to victory. You see, but tactics without a strategy is the noise before defeat. And so what we propose as new evangelicals is a strategy of the common good. And you will see that my title here is the president of the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. Drawn from Catholic social teaching. The common good has at least 5 connotations. The first being that it refers to the good of all people, all classes, and each individual, body and soul. Talk reality here. The reason that old guard evangelicalism has become discredited, among other reasons, you see, is that it has identified itself with the Republican Party. In other words, anyone who happens to disagree with the way American evangelicalism conducts itself in public life is accused, like me, of being a liberal. The old way of thinking says we define ourselves in opposition to something else. And if the progressives think that, then we're not that. So a common good strategy understands that there are power imbalances in society that require attention, very importantly, to the least fortunate and most powerless people, that their good might also be advanced, not just the good of the wealthy. So, finally, the good is common. The good is common in the sense that God created all of us to share in it in community. Sounds like a Japanese idea. I had lunch today with a pastor of a church, local church here, and we were discussing what distinguishes Japanese culture from American culture. And what we had decided, you see, that is it's this Japanese concept of community that distinguishes itself over against American individualism. Montessori and I were discussing this over lunch, and we decided that, you see, he, a younger Japanese, who is himself an evangelical Christian, likewise can contribute, you see, concepts of the common good and community to those of us who are evangelicals in America who have opted, you see, for a high kind of individualism. Common good strategy, I think, is, you see, it's not just about what's good for evangelicals, it's about what's good for all citizens. And so this is the strategy that I believe that American evangelicals, the new evangelicals, are going to pursue on all of these issues, you see, because the environment, caring for it, is really about natural resources that belong to everybody. It requires us to care, you see, about those who might in the future become the victims of nuclear terrorism, because they are our neighbor too. It requires... By the way, our wonderful interpreter today said that she met Dr. E.O. Wilson here in Kyoto about 10 years ago. And so I understand that Dr. Wilson has been here before, and you may well know him. Reaching out, you see, to care about the biosphere, Dr. E.O. Wilson has reached back to us by writing a book called The Creation, which is very fascinating. A secularist, you see, he calls himself an agnostic, writing a book called The Creation, which by its very name implies there's a creator. This is the kind of strategy that can build a better society. By the way, I want to tell you one more story on the subject of the environment. Dr. Gus Speth at Yale University puts it this way. Gus Speth was an advisor to Jimmy Carter in the White House when Carter was president. And this is how he puts it. He says, 30 years ago, I thought that with enough good science, we'd be able to solve the environmental crisis. Wrong. I used to think that the greatest problems threatening the planet were pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change. Gus Speth says, I was wrong there too. I now believe that the greatest problems we face are pride, apathy, and greed. It's because that's what's keeping us from solving the environmental problem. And for that, we need a cultural and a spiritual transformation. And he says, we in the scientific community don't know how, but he says, you evangelicals, you do know how to do that. And he says, we need your help. And so, you see, we've reached out in that way across this religion-science divide, and the scientists have reached back, and the name-calling has come to an end. The era of cooperation is over. The era of cooperation is at hand, and none too soon. And the era of, you see, this war is over. So, I say we need a new vision to think more clearly. I've said we needed a new vision to think more clearly. I think we need tactics that require us to act more boldly. I want to quote Barack Obama because I saw him just a few days ago before he went to Copenhagen. It wasn't at a meeting, it was at a holiday reception on December 11th, December 13th. Foyer of the White House, the president comes down with the first lady, he makes a few remarks, and greets people for a few minutes and leaves. Tall. I'm tall. I'm tall. So I can reach over people's heads. So I'm able to reach over a whole lot of people's heads, to reach out of my hand and say, Mr. President. And you may not, Copenhagen had almost broken up. The Chinese were headed toward the airport. The Indians were already ready to leave too. It included the Brazilians and other countries was being held, and President Obama, on what was supposed to be only an 8-hour trip, goes for 12 hours, and he goes right into the meeting where it's being held. By his personal intervention into Copenhagen, he saved it in so many ways. When I had said to him, Mr. President, you need to go to Copenhagen, and you need to do everything you can, you see, on this subject, the President did exactly that, and we have an ally in the White House on this and the issue of nuclear weaponry. When I spoke to President Obama, he points back to me and he says, but we need your help. The United States Senate. I told you I was going to quote Barack Obama, so I will quote him. Speaking to the United Nations on September 23 last year, President Obama said the following. And this is really important for those of you, particularly who are here as a result of the institute that we're going to be meeting together afterwards. Sizemore. CISMR. This is the center of the institute. We're going to meet afterwards. Listen particularly to the words of President Obama. that in the year 2009, more than at any point in human history, of nations and peoples are shared. The religious convictions that we hold in our hearts can forge new bonds among people, or they can tear us apart. I made the same kind of speech in Cairo last year, as you may recall. And what the religious leadership, most of all, that is needed on these issues. And why is that? That religion inspires, you see, that leads people to act in the most deeply felt of ways. Here's why. Demographers who study populations say that 80% of most people aren't going to change their minds. Sad. But he says, but demographers' studies of students of public opinion say that people will shift their public opinion if there is a disconnect between their highest aspirations and the status quo. There has to be some people who disturb them out of their equilibrium. And what President Obama is essentially saying is that it's the religious community itself. It's scholarly institutions such as you have here. It is these leaders who are able to help people make the shift from the way things are to the way they ought to be in a kindly, winsome, and persuasive way. Leadership is not just allowing people to have their say. Leadership, you see, is making it possible for the hard truths to be told. Words come from an author of a book called From Good to Great, Jim Collins. It's making it possible for the hard truths to be told. And right now, I would say, back to my own evangelical community in America, the hard truth is the American evangelical community needs to be born again. The reason that strikes home and is almost too difficult for some evangelicals to hear is because it's the evangelicals who are going around the world telling everybody else they need. I'll close with this story. It's kind of a story that you would hear out of the Orient, because it's the story of a sage who dispenses advice from the town center and about young men and women who come to him for advice. It goes like this. The two young kids were tired of the leadership being offered by the old man who sat in the public square dispensing advice. They planned to discredit him. Putting a bird in their hands, they went to the sage, the wise man, and asked him, "Is the bird alive or dead?" They thought they had him tricked. The sage said the bird was alive. They would simply use their thumb and reach in and break the bird's neck and prove their elder wrong. Now, if the sage said the bird was dead, they would open their hands and reveal the bird very much alive. And so with bird in hand, they went to the square confident of their plan. I tell the story because I've been on over 40 campuses around the United States, and a lot of those students are like the two young kids who come to the man in the square with the bird in hand. And you see, to answer the question of this lecture, what changes are happening? The changes that are happening are really big. Big issues. Will humanity survive the threat of climate change? What do we do about the threat of nuclear terrorism? Mary tells me it's not a question of if. It's a question of when a terrorist will secure nuclear weapons and ignite it in an American city. Just anybody saying this is the former Secretary of Defense, William Perry. And so these young people in America, in their evangelical institutions, are a bit fed up, as am I, with the old leadership. And so to finish the story, they ask the sage in the square with the bird in their hands, "Is the bird alive or dead?" And the sage wisely responded, as you may have guessed. He said, "My children, the answer is in your hands." I close my chapel addresses, as I've said, with the words of John Wesley, the great evangelist of American Methodism, who wrote A Charge to Keep, which he puts this way. And I would suggest that it applies to all in this room today. And it's a challenge to us all, and it goes like this. serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. To serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. Oh, may it all do my master's will. Arm me with jealous care, as in thy sight to live. He closes his prayer saying, and oh, thy servant lead, prepare a strict account to give. It's my great honor to be with you. Thank you very much.